So to give you an example of a special warranty deed, oftentimes when a bank forecloses on a property, if that property is not purchased on the courthouse steps by another party, what the lender does is they take it in-house and then they remarket it. So when they're remarketing that property, they basically say, hey, look, here's the deal. If you buy this property from us, the bank, we're going to give you a special warranty deed, which means we didn't do anything to harm the title. And you say, well, you only owned it for a short period of time. Would a buyer be comfortable with that? So let me put the things in your mind that make you understand. And by the way, there's going to be attorneys involved in this in the field. So agents don't make these decisions. So here's why, as a buyer, I would feel comfortable under a special warranty deed from the bank. First of all, the bank didn't do anything to harm the title. Prior to that, the bank foreclosed on the property. So do you remember that the foreclosure has the effect that it clears liens from the title? Doesn't pay them, but it clears liens from the title. So the bank didn't harm the title. The foreclosure sale cleared the title of liens. And then the fact of the matter is, if my title insurance company gives me title insurance on the property or sells me title insurance on the property, they're basically saying they will defend any defects. So I, as the buyer, actually feel comfortable because I've done my research, my attorney did a title search, and we got a title insurance policy. I'm fine buying property under a special warranty deed. General is better. Special is a definition, and now you have one example of how a special warranty deed might be used. Then we get to quitclaim deeds, and quitclaim deeds simply are, they just simply transfer title. Whatever interest I have in a property, I can transfer it to you under a quitclaim deed. Having said that, I'm not giving you any warranties. So if something comes up, a title issue comes up, I'm not going to defend you. Don't call me, call your title insurance company, call your attorney, whatever. Don't call me. Now, quitclaim deeds are a little bit rare, but they're actually not uncommon in certain types of situations. My example to you is going to be a divorce type situation. I had this come up the other day. A couple is, matter of fact, I'll tell you the whole conversation. So a couple is separated, soon to be divorced, but they're selling the house now before the divorce actually takes place. They're trying to settle the estate, right? So the agent comes to me and says, well, how can the husband transfer the property to the wife? Do they have to go through a sale or whatever? And I said, no. He can simply quitclaim his interest to the wife, saying, I no longer have interest in the property. It's now yours. And so when we talked about this for a second, I added to that, but you do understand, you need to talk to an attorney so an attorney can advise them, because there might be lenders involved. There might be other liens involved as well. And the quitclaim deed says, whatever is mine is now yours. They're commonly used in situations such as a divorce. They are also commonly used to correct mistakes in deeds. So for example, when I buy property, oftentimes people butcher my name. They spell Barnett without an E, or they mess up my middle name or something to that effect. And later when I get ready to transfer title, sometimes the attorney will say something to the effect of, hey, is this you? And I'll say, yeah. And they say, well, for the public record, we just want to correct it and make sure that Chris Barnett without an E is the same as Chris Barnett with an E. So I just transferred title from myself to myself to correct that error that was in the previous deed. Occasionally something like that will come up. Again, the attorneys will take care of this. Bargain and sell deed, the only reason I even mention the bargain and sell deed is that you take a national exam, right? And a bargain and sell deed is going to be roughly the equivalent of a quitclaim deed. It's just used in other states. And again, it just says, hey, I own the property, I'm selling it to you, and don't come after me for any warranties. It's common in other states, not North Carolina, okay? So tight little package there. Why is general warranty deed the best? When might you see a special warranty deed? And then I have seen one question that's really kind of confusing on this, and I don't know if it's meant to be confusing, but I'm going to point this out to you just real quickly. If you buy property at a foreclosure on a short sale, you will end up getting the equivalent of a quitclaim deed. That's if you buy it on the courthouse steps. It's called a trustee deed, but there are no warranties to it. The reason I wanted to point that out to you, did you notice that if nobody buys it on the courthouse steps that day, the bank takes it into inventory, and then when they sell it, they'll issue a special warranty deed. So it gets a little bit confusing about what happens in a foreclosure. If somebody buys it at the courthouse steps, quitclaim deed. If nobody buys it and the bank remarkets it, special warranty deed, okay? All right, through with that little package. So we'll move on closely associated with this. But most of these words I mentioned as in talking about deeds. So we'll do this tight little package right here about title assurance. Now, again, as a buyer, when I buy property, I don't know that all this is, most buyers don't know this is going on in the background, but all these things are going on. First of all, the attorney is doing a title examination. I don't think we're going to ask you this question on the exam. However, I will tell you this. Anybody can do a title exam. And usually it's going to be a legal assistant or a paralegal or someone like that who does the title search, the title examination. What they will do is they will write a title abstract. It's a summary of it. It's in prose form. They write down the history of that deed, that title. And then they take it to an attorney, and an attorney writes an opinion of title. So, Charles, how do you know that you have good title? Well, somebody searched the title, they wrote a book about it, and the attorney looked at it and said, hey, it looks like you have good title. So if you have good title, when you transfer it to someone else, they should have good title. Now, while anyone can do a title exam, only an attorney can do an opinion of title, right? And that's the significant point of that. Now, when we talk about title assurance, I want you to put a couple of things together. The seller in the general warranty deed told me he had good title, but I didn't trust him. So I had an attorney do a title search and a title opinion, but you know what? Attorneys make mistakes as well. So I'm also going to buy title insurance. You don't need to know a lot about title insurance for the exam. However, here's a couple of things about title insurance that are important. Title insurance is a one-time purchase. You do it at closing, and the attorney will order the title insurance policy for you. It's usually, the cost of it's fairly minimal. It's $2 per thousand of purchase price is what it amounts to. And the buyer pays for the title insurance. So anyway, what happens with the title insurance, you have to visualize this a little bit. I buy title insurance today at closing, but it protects me in the future for claims arising from the past. Did you notice that? In other words, when I buy title insurance today, yes, it does protect me in the future, but it only protects me against claims arising from the past. If I do something stupid and mess up the title, it's certainly not going to protect me from that. Nikki, I can never tell whether you're looking like you have a question or if you're just kind of taking it all in. So
just taking it all in.
Okay. So if you have a question, I can see your face, so just wave or something, and I'll give clarification. To be quite honest with you, if you got what I said about title insurance, you're okay. I mean, it's a little bit of a long shot that you're going to get questions on this anyway, because we only have a few questions to ask you. And so anyway, title assurance, it's more than just title insurance. It's the seller, it's the attorney, and it's title insurance. That makes me feel like I have good title so that I don't have to worry about someone coming and taking over my property. Literally just a definition right here. The North Carolina Marketable Title Act serves as a 30-year statute of limitations of claims against title. The reason we have this in North Carolina is think about how much rural land we have. During the class, I told you a story about a case in Roanoke Rapids where they were developing the Dolly Parton Theater. And some of those rural lands had been passed down through generations, and sometimes there were people that came in and out of ownership of those. So what happens is if you had a claim on that title, you need to have done it within 30 years. If not, North Carolina has a law that seeks to extinguish claims of greater than 30 years in the past. So if someone comes up from 1920 and says, hey, my great-great-grandfather lost this in a poker game, well, I'm sorry, you should have made that claim earlier, okay? That's the purpose of the Marketable Title Act. Excise tax is actually more important, but the reason it's more important is because it's going to come up on the math when we do our settlement statements. And technically we don't do settlement statements, but I don't know if you remember doing the mini closing statement. We will have a math session where we'll talk about these, but I'll kind of start peppering you with math stuff to remind you to get that part of your brain lubricated again as well. Excise tax is simply just a transfer tax. That's all it is. It's a state, capital S, a state tax for the conveyance of real property. And the cost is $1 per 500 of sale price or any portion thereof. When we do the settlement statement, we will just simply take the sale price divided by 500. Bam, that'll be your excise tax. And it's always paid by the seller at closing. I'm teaching a class with my current agents right now. And one of the things we're talking about is net to seller. And it's one of the items when you're calculating net to seller that the seller needs to know that they pay so they can figure that into how much they're going to walk home with. Okay. All right. So we're through with that chapter, and then we move on to land use controls. Important, but very succinct chapter. You're looking at 2, maybe 3 questions here in this chapter. Now, in regards to land use controls, part of the theme is going to be public versus private. And I got to be honest with you, as I talk through that, that's probably going to be one of the test questions right there. Public versus private. Is it the city that's doing it to you, or is it the HOA that's doing it to you? That's all I'm talking about when I say public versus private. You can see the public controls include zoning. I can't build a quad on my property because I'm zoned for single family. Building codes, I have to meet a certain minimal standard. Interstate land sale is not a big deal. But then subdivision subdivision ordinances, I mentioned this to you as we came through class, so I want to remind you right here, because if you're looking for it, you'll pause and you'll get it. When I say subdivision ordinances, I use the word ordinances, that refers to a law. Okay, if I use subdivision ordinances or regulations, that's law. If I use subdivision restrictive covenants, that's private. Okay, so that's what I mean by the public-private thing. Keep an eye on that. Terminology. Non-conforming use. You were grandfathered in. You remember this concept? You were grandfathered in, okay? Now, I know it appears that you're acting outside of the current zoning, but that's okay because you were there first. And so you're going to be allowed to continue. Usually on the exam, what's going to happen is out of these 3 or 4 words that we have here, 5 words, you're probably going to have 1, maybe 2 questions if you're lucky, but certainly 1 question. And really, you just have to discern between the 2 of them. So in talking about the non-conforming use, you were there first. You're allowed to continue, even though you're outside of the zoning ordinance. Clearly, the word that they're going to compare to that is an illegal use. An illegal use means you started using it in defiance of the zoning ordinance, and you knew what the zoning ordinance was. Okay, you weren't there first. I got to be honest with you. It actually doesn't matter if you know what the zoning ordinance is. All that matters is that you're breaking it. Okay, so non-conforming use, grandfathered in. Illegal use, you weren't grandfathered in and you broke the rule anyway, okay? So that's actually a fairly straightforward question. If you get that one, I kind of hope that you do. Trying to think on non-conforming use. I have some good notes there, but I don't think they're getting deeper than that, to be honest with you. Zoning amendment is the same thing as a zoning change or rezoning. There is a process. If you want to know what that process is, go to the municipality's website, which makes it really, really hard for us to write a test question on it. So just understand that zoning amendment is the same as rezoning, and that there is a process, and it has to follow some type of orderly law. In other words, they can't come and change my zoning. There has to be a due process hearing and stuff like that to do it. Okay, not too worried about zoning amendment. Then I get to variance. Variance is a great test question. So I just got to believe that it's the one that's going to show up, if anything. So variance is a slight deviation from strict adherence to the zoning ordinance. Now, again, this is where a picture paints 1,000 words, but it's hard for us to paint a picture while we're here. But I promise you in the notes, I always tell the same story when I do my lecture on variance. And what it has to do with is a friend of mine who purchased a lot, and she was not able to fit her house on the lot because it sat 6 inches into the setback. So she didn't ask the city to change the zoning. What she did ask is a slight deviation from strict adherence to the zoning ordinance. Hey guys, can you give me 6 inches of space here, okay? Because I'm setting in the setback. So with the variance, it's a slight deviation from the zoning ordinance. It's based on a unique hardship. In other words, this is not something we should do to build a subdivision. Every once in a while, you'll have a lot in a subdivision that needs a variance, but we should not go into it planning to need those variances. We're going to argue this before a board of adjustments. A board of adjustments is a citizen panel. They're your peers. And basically what we're asking is, if you give me this variance to allow me to use my property in this profitable way, it will not change the essential characteristics of the neighborhood. No one's going to know that I had it other than on the public record. So a variance. Now, let me just go ahead and make it straightforward for you. Only for exam purposes, the one that they try to trick you with on variance is they try to make you think that they're talking about a zoning change. But remember, in a variance, I'm not asking for a zoning change. I'm just asking for an acknowledgement of my slight deviation and that the city will allow that. But otherwise, the zoning ordinance stays the same. Okay. Special uses are slightly complicated. The question that we used to ask on special use had to do with something like a daycare center. So think about this for just a minute. Matter of fact, I don't have to think about it. I'm living it right now because my neighborhood is built in a single family, we're a single family neighborhood, right? At the top of our subdivision, there is a daycare. And you say, well, how in the world does a daycare get there? It's not single family. Well, what happens is in every zoned area, there is a whole list of special uses that are allowed. And so what happens is when someone came and requested a daycare center there, what they did is they went to the zoning ordinance and said, hey, it's among the special uses that are allowed here. And you say, why would somebody, why would a zoning ordinance have uses that are allowed outside of what it was zoned for? And the idea is to benefit the public. In my neighborhood, we have a gazillion kids. It makes sense that there's something that benefits parents, that they would have something close by to take it to. So daycare centers fall into that category. Schools and hospitals fall into that category. Matter of fact, the school, walking distance from my house, is in a residential zoned area. It's clearly not residential, but it's allowed because it benefits the public. There's a technical distinction between variance and special uses. I tend to think that they're not that similar. However, for test purposes, if they want to ask you a bizarrely hard question on this, the technical distinction between a variance and a special use is this. If someone requests a special use, all they do is go to the zoning ordinance and say, hey, look, it says right here that we can put a daycare center here. And if they are otherwise okay with the zone, they're not offensive to the zoning ordinance. In other words, they can meet the setbacks, the height restrictions and stuff like that. Then they are in, here's the technical distinction. With a special use, you're entitled to it as a matter of right if you can prove that it's in the ordinance. Whereas in a variance, you remember in a variance, I was asking for a slight deviation. The Board of Adjustments could say yes, but the Board of Adjustments could say no as well. So the technical distinction in a variance, you're not entitled to it. You can get it, but you're not entitled to it. Special use, you're entitled to it as a matter of right if you can prove that your case is compelling. Okay. Overlay districts, at this point, I think you're probably okay on overlay districts. There is a zoning map. An overlay is just simply an extra layer of bureaucracy, so to speak. The most common one that you'll run into would be a historic overlay. So not only do I have to abide by the single family regulations, but I also have to follow certain architectural requirements if I'm in the historic overlay. To me, that feels fairly straightforward. And then spot zoning, this is the one that I was concerned about with variance. But in spot zoning, you're actually asking for a different type of zoning. Spot zoning is one property that's zoned differently from the properties around it. So watch out for that trick between variance and spot zoning. Variance, slight deviation. Spot zoning, you're literally zoned different than everybody else. These last words right here are great little vocabulary words. Whether they are the answer or not, they can be dropped in to try to confuse you. But fortunately, their names, if you'll relax your brain, their names are roughly what you believe they would be. For example, a buffer zone. Do you recognize that at some point when zoning changes, there's always going to be a harsh line? When it goes from residential to commercial, I mean, think about it. You could put a little tiny house here and a great big commercial building here, and that just doesn't feel right. So what happens with cluster zones is buffer zones, there is a buffer between the two, between the change in zoning. That's the idea of a buffer zone. It's exactly what you think it is. I would encourage you sometime when you're riding around and looking at when it goes from residential to commercial, how they buffer it so that it's not so dramatic, okay? Cluster zoning is a little more difficult to understand, but it still means what it says it is. So for example, in a cluster zone neighborhood, the neighborhood that I live in right now, we have quarter-acre lots. We have one house and we have a quarter acre to set that house on. If you look at the house next to me, it's a quarter-acre lot with a house on it. House next to it, quarter-acre lot with a house on it, okay? Now, in cluster zoning, it might still be that there is a quarter acre allocated for every house, but the houses are clustered together. You see this a lot of time in zero lot line communities. So even though the houses are all together, there is enough land that there is roughly a quarter acre per house. And you say, well, what's the purpose of clustering? Clustering is supposed to be more efficient. It allows for more green space. That's actually, if they were going to ask you a test question, the purpose of cluster zoning is it allows for more green space. Why does it allow for more green space? Because all the houses are over here, which gives you room to put parks and stuff like that. It's also considered to be more environmentally sensitive because there's not as much runoff because there's not as many driveways and stuff like that. So anyway, cluster zoning, if you think about it, houses are all clustered together. Why? To allow for more green space, okay? And then when you see bulk regulations have to talk about not just linear area, not just ground level, but also it talks about the idea, bulk regulations talk about how large you can build buildings. So in other words, it would also include things like height restrictions as well. So how much bulk can you have in a particular area? Okay, now I consider all those words that we just came through to be another little tight section as well. Non-conforming use through bulk regulations. Vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. You're going to get it. It's not hard, and hopefully the questions will make sense to you when you see them. Compare those words to each other. Ask me questions if you need to on that. Once we get to subdivision regulations, though, I need you to treat this as a whole separate little package because I like this on the North Carolina section for an exam. The Real Estate Commission has beat us about the head for the last several years about subdivision regulations. So I just got to believe they're asking test questions on it. So in regards to subdivision regulations, let me remind you this. Subdivision regulation is public law. In other words, this is the municipality, be it city or county, telling me whether I can build a subdivision or not. So when you say, well, why would the city or county care? Well, think about it. If I've been growing soybeans on my 40 acres for the last 10 years, and all of a sudden I want to start growing 100 houses on that same 40 acres, it affects the infrastructure. So that's why the municipality has a say in this. I have to submit a plan. I have to go through engineering. You don't need to know any of that unless you plan on becoming a developer. But having said that, the municipality will either approve it or deny it, depending on the plan and the plan for the city. So now that I'm getting ready to create a subdivision, the first thing I need to do is define a subdivision. This used to be a test question. I hope it still is, because if it is, it's a slam dunk for you. The definition of a subdivision is a division of a tract of land into 2 or more lots for the purpose of resale or development. Oftentimes when I think about a subdivision, I think about my neighborhood and it's 900 homes, but to be quite honest with you, it would still have been a subdivision if this land was only divided into 2 lots for the purpose of resale or development, okay? So there's your definition right there. The test question used to say something to the effect of a subdivision is how many lots minimal or something like that. So the answer was 2, and then they had some other answers thrown in there. It didn't matter. The answer is 2 or more for the purpose of resale or development. It is illegal. The reason it's important to the commission is it's illegal to sell a lot in an unapproved subdivision. And the logic behind this is if you sell a lot in an unapproved subdivision, well, did you make sure that your buyer could get water, sewer, electric, roads, ingress, egress, stuff like that? That's why subdivisions have to be approved to see if they could be used for the consumer. Important, important, easy, okay? Important, hard. Subdivision street disclosure. I don't know if you remember the pains in class that I went over the subdivision street disclosure statement, but I will tell you, outside of Learn, Test, Pass, I also sent you a first and second midterm. I think I also sent you a full-length final that was created by the Association of Realtors and the Association of Educators. But there's some great, great questions on there about subdivision street disclosures. I think I hit it 2 or 3 times in and among those tests. Make sure you go back and study those, and I will remind you what you're looking for. Subdivision street disclosure. The first buyer of every lot in a subdivision deserves to know whether the road in front of their house is public or privately maintained, okay? So by law in North Carolina, we have a requirement for a subdivision street disclosure statement. Hey, buyer, the road in front of your house is private. Now, I don't want you to get too bent out of shape on this. I just want you to know it's okay for that road to be private. Now, in the field, I would love for you to remember when you get out and start actually selling homes, I would love for you to remember that if it's a private road, there probably needs to be some mechanism in place for repairing that road or spending money to it. In other words, like an HOA or a private road maintenance agreement. For test purposes, knowing that a road can be a private road is fine. That's absolutely okay. Buyer, you were told, if you didn't like it, don't buy here. Roads in a subdivision could also be publicly maintained. Now, in regards to publicly maintained, here's where the question gets tricky. Just because the developer told you it was going to be a public road, until it's turned over to the Department of Transportation, it is not yet publicly maintained. So there may be times where a buyer is told that the road is going to be a public road, but because the subdivision is so new, the Department of Transportation hasn't taken those roads into inventory yet. So even though you were told it was going to be public, it's not yet public. So therefore it's still acting as a private road. Well, what happens if the developer goes bankrupt? If the developer goes bankrupt before turning it over to DOT, the problem is you think you're on a public road, but it's actually a private road, okay? So now what do the test questions look like? Again, you've got some great ones in your packet, so make sure you go back and look at that. But private's okay, public's okay, but just because the developer said it was going to be public, it's not until the Department of Transportation has taken it back over. Those are the bullet points that you need to remember for test purposes, okay? And again, keep in mind, you're welcome to throw up your hand and ask questions if you want to, but that's the succinctness with which you're going to study that. Building codes, let your brain relax here. Building codes are construction codes. In other words, right now we're talking about land use controls, and all of a sudden we switch to building codes. If I remember correctly, what people are telling me is that the test tries to confuse you between zoning ordinances and building codes. Well, zoning controls how you use land. Building codes have to do with safety requirements of construction. Make sense so far? And you say, well, then how can they confuse you if it's that simple? The reason that they can confuse you on this is that in some ways, building codes are land use restrictions, and here's why. I mentioned earlier, I want to build a quad on my property, a 4-unit apartment complex, but I'm zoned single family. Well, if that's the case, I'm never going to get a permit to be able to build a quad. And that's what I mean by them being land use restrictions. Building codes are technically construction standards, but if I can't get a permit, I just can't use the property in that manner. That's how it comes into this category, okay? I'm not too worried about Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. Now, keep in mind, I do use Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act sometimes just to teach people how to read the name of an act. And if it tells you everything you need to know, then fine, don't worry about it. Interstate means crossing state lines. Land sales means you're selling a property without a house on it. Full Disclosure Act, if I'm going to sell land across state lines, apparently there's something I'm going to have to tell you. And the reason that this was important was because of all the fraud and the scams that were involved in selling property this way. If in fact they ask you a test question about this, which is a long shot, I bet you it has to do with the fact that the property is being sold sight unseen. So basically you're up there in New York and I'm trying to sell you something at Carolina Beach, some land in Carolina Beach. Well, I have to make certain disclosures because too many scams are built on that, okay? I'm not too worried about that. Environmental concerns, you're going to get a question here, I hope. If you don't get a question right here, I don't think the exam writers have done their job, because it's important for you to understand that as agents, environmental concerns are material facts, okay? And then they give you examples of 3 of the most common that you run into on a daily basis. There'll be some others, but I tend to find that these are the most important. So 2 important facts so far. 1, agents are responsible for environmental concerns that you have the ability to discover because they are material facts. Now let's get specific. Lead-based paint. And what I would do if I were you is I would just kind of bullet point lead-based paint. There's about 3 or 4 facts that you need to know about lead-based paint. And then once you get down that, it's interesting. If you want to know everything, that's fine. But to be quite honest with you, here's the first thing we need to know. Lead-Based Paint Act addresses houses built before 1978. Built before 1978. If it was built January 1st, 1978 and beyond, it does not matter according to this law. So houses built before 1978, now there's going to be a mandatory disclosure, and that's the lead-based paint disclosure statement. Now, this is going to occur whether it's a for sale by owner or whether there's an agent involved. The agents, you're responsible for making sure that your clients fill these out. Now, let me remind you what the requirements are for a seller. Again, if I wanted to ask you an insanely hard question about lead-based paint, it would be what the seller is required to do versus what you can ask them to do. The seller is only required to do three things if their house was built before 1978. First of all, they have to provide you an EPA pamphlet. And if you're the agent, they're going to say, where do I get that pamphlet? And you're going to get it from them. It's easy to obtain online. Okay, you don't even have to spend any money. So the seller has to provide the pamphlet. They have to provide a lead-based paint disclosure statement. And the lead-based paint disclosure statement is important, but it's not hard. What I mean by that is the lead-based paint statement asks the seller this question. Hey, seller, are you aware of any lead in your home? 95 out of 100 times, the seller is going to say, no, I'm not aware of any lead in my home. And they're not saying there's no lead. They're saying they have no knowledge of there being any lead in their home, okay? So the pamphlet, the disclosure statement, even though for most part it's not disclosing anything, and then the seller provides a 10-day risk assessment period to the buyer. And during that 10-day risk assessment period, what the buyer is doing is trying to decide whether they want to have that house assessed for lead. Those are the only three things that the seller has to do: pamphlet, disclosure, and 10-day risk assessment period. Here's where the test tries to confuse you. The test tries to confuse you and say, well, the buyer does an exam and finds out that there's lead in the home. Does the seller have to remediate it? And the answer is no. The seller could just simply say, well, that's fine. I'm not going to do anything about it. Buyer, you can walk away during the 10-day risk assessment period if you want to, but I'm not going to repair it. One last trick, but this is more of a trick in the field than it is on the exam. If a buyer does a test, finds out there's lead, and then walks away from the home, the problem that the seller has is now in the future on the disclosure statement, he has to say he's aware of lead because there's been a test involved. Did that make sense to you, what I'm saying? Okay, same as we said before, right? All right, so two important facts so far. 1978, three things that the seller has to do. Watch out for the tricks on that. And then the third important part about all of these environmental concerns is, what is the health concern? Why do we even have this act? The health concern, keep in mind, for lead-based paint, it's neurological damage, damage to the brain and the central nervous system. We don't test you on cancer when it comes to lead-based paint. It's brain and central nervous system, okay? Typically in children under the age of 6 is the problem. Notice that I put remediation down here as well. And if you want to get rid of lead-based paint, you got to get rid of it. I mean, you take it down, you pack it up, you send it out, or you melt it off the walls, collect it, whatever. Remediation is going to be a theme as well in these others, okay? So the next concern is asbestos. Now, asbestos, you don't need to know this, but it's a hook-shaped microscopic fiber. The problem with that is you breathe it in, you don't know. It's hook-shaped, so it sticks to the liners of your lungs. Now we're getting to what you need to know. The health concern associated with asbestos, of course, is lung cancer. Technically, lung cancer and stomach cancer. Lung cancer is usually what you see on the exams. Okay, so that's the health concern. And then we throw in a little bit of vocabulary for you. The key word with asbestos is friable, okay? If asbestos is friable, crumbling, deteriorating, problem with that is it becomes airborne, and now you can breathe it in, okay? So friable is an important word associated with asbestos. And then when we talk about remediation with asbestos, look, you could take it all down if you want to, package it up, dispose of it. But you know what else you could do with asbestos is you could encapsulate it. Oftentimes with, it's in insulation in old homes, in insulation around plumbing, for example. And if you can take it and encapsulate it, guess what? Now it can't become airborne. So if you ever see the word encapsulation on the exam as a remediation, it's probably talking about asbestos. That would be absolutely okay. All right. And then finally, radon, you can see there, second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. So again, the health concern, lung cancer, asbestos and radon, both lung cancer. Now, another cheesy question, I hope you get this one on the exam because it's so easy, but another cheesy question that they used to ask about radon is how could you detect it? And some people say, well, it has a strong fruity smell or something like that. That is not true. Radon is colorless. It's odorless. There's only one way to detect it, and that's having a radon test done. Okay, so watch out for any questions on the exam that lead you to believe there's any way of detecting radon other than a test. And then finally, for the remediation of radon, radon dissipates harmlessly in open air. Another way they can say that is it's usually a problem in enclosed environments. And so, well, how do you get rid of it? You just simply ventilate the area. So the way that you remediate radon is by a series of vents and vacuums that sucks the air out and gets it outside of the home. So remediation for radon is ventilation. Remediation for asbestos was encapsulation. Remediation for lead-based paint, you got to tear it out and get rid of it. Other environmental concerns may pop up. If I had to guess, what other questions would I think would come up on environmental concerns? Maybe something about mold. But if you have a question that has to do with mold, it would have to be associated with there being a water problem. In other words, if there's a mold problem, there's a water problem. They can't go any deeper than that on mold because we just don't know enough actual facts that we can test you on mold. Certainly, if you're selling a property and it has an underground storage tank, if you're selling a property that's on an old place where they used to have a dry cleaner and it's dumped chemicals, all of these would be material facts. They might ask the question that way. And then finally, one thing we have picked up in talking to students is they trick you on this because normally in anything having to do with real estate, once it gets over the agent's head, we always say call an attorney, call an accountant, call structural engineer, whatever. If it's an environmental concern, don't call an attorney. They won't know what the heck to do. You call an environmental assessor. That's what you do. Okay. In other words, that's the way they try to trick you on that. But there are people who assess these environmental issues. That's who you call. Perk test. I don't even know why I put this here, but I put it here to make sure I didn't forget to say it at some point in time. So don't necessarily just associate this with environmental concerns, but you do need to know this word. And I put a star beside it. Hopefully, if you're familiar with it, it won't be a big deal. It probably should say PERC because it comes from the word percolation. All right. What I do want you to have in your notes, or at least to have an awareness of, perk tests today are called soil, SOIL, soil suitability test. And from what I understand is they used to test you on the word perk test, and then they changed the wording to soil suitability. But as I understand it, they went back to using the word perk test on the exams. So anyway, just know that those words are the same for our purposes. And all a perk test is to determine whether your property can support a traditional septic system or not. The way septic systems work is they separate the sludge from the effluent runs on and it percolates down through the soil and the soil cleanses it. That's the idea of the way a septic tank works in short, okay? So perk test, it's going to be associated with septic tanks. Hey, look, if you don't need a septic tank, if you're connected to public water and sewer, you're not going to have a perk test done, okay? If you get that in the right ballpark, you're fine. Oh, no, there is one more thing, and it's not in your notes here. Do you remember this? That septic permits are issued based on the number of bedrooms, not the number of bathrooms. Perk tests, septic permits are issued based on the number of bedrooms. The logic being 2 people per bedroom would be the max that a house could hold. Okay. Flood hazard areas, just kind of the FYI on flood hazard areas. Flood hazard areas kind of work as an overlay district. So in other words, you had restrictions on the property already, but if you're in a flood hazard area, you're going to have more restrictions on the property. Can you buy property in a flood area? Yeah, obviously you can buy a property in a flood area. But if you have a loan, you're going to have to pay flood insurance, right? Some of the most desirable places in North Carolina are actually in flood zones, okay? FEMA determines where the flood maps are. It's a material fact if a property is in a flood zone because there's going to be additional costs. And if you ever see the letters NFPA, N as in Nancy, NFIP. It stands for National Flood Insurance Program. National Flood Insurance Program. The significance of that is the flood insurance program is backed by the federal government. You would buy a flood policy from your local agent, but it's backed by the federal government. And did you notice what I just said there? You buy it from your local insurance agent. Flood is not covered under your standard policy. If you want to be covered for flood, which is water rising from the ground, you have to buy a separate NFIP policy for it. All that makes sense? Sound familiar? Okay. And then finally, in that little chapter, private land use controls, private land use controls, these are your restrictive covenants. These are your deed restrictions. And so let's go to the most obvious. In regards to restrictive covenants, what do I need you to know? Well, first of all, because it's a private restriction, watch out for this on the exam, okay? This reads like it makes sense, but it's wrong, okay? If it's a private restriction, if it's a restrictive covenant, do not fall for any answer that leads you to believe that this is going to be enforced by a public official. So in other words, the zoning enforcement officer does not care if you're breaking your restrictive covenants. The zoning enforcement officer does care if you're breaking zoning laws, okay? So the question becomes, who does enforce restrictive covenants? And the answer is, you can see the second bullet point there, the developer created them. So while the developer's there, they will enforce them. The developer can't wait till they've got enough homeowners that they can turn it over to the homeowners association, because then the HOA can enforce it. Or any homeowner could enforce against the other. And we talked about this on Wednesday. Remember the two important things. I can enforce against any homeowner that is held to the same restrictions that I am. I don't care if you're a mile away. If your dog's barking and it bothers me, I can, in fact, enforce against you. And then the other thing was, the most important potential question on this is, if there is a discrepancy or if there is a conflict between, oh, I'm sorry, it's the third bullet point. If there's a conflict between zoning and homeowner associations, the most restrictive will always rule. That should be a theme that you have in your mind. Anytime you're looking at laws, anytime you're looking at regulations versus covenants, the most restrictive will rule, okay? All right, so now we have finished land use controls. How you guys doing so far? Doing okay so far? All right, all right. Jackie, I can't see you, but you haven't asked any questions, so I'm assuming you're doing okay there as well. All right. Let's go for about 10 more minutes before we take a break. Then we'll take a break. We'll probably only go just a little over a couple hours today, and I have a little short quiz for you in Kahoots, a little 10-question quiz. So we'll get back in the habit of taking questions again under stress, okay? All right, now something important is getting ready to happen for our next several sessions, because we're getting into agency now, right? And agency, we know, is going to be such a significant part of the exam. We're talking 12 to 18 questions here. I mean, we're talking national and stateside, so you just have to know it so well. Fortunately, we spent a ton of time on it in class, okay? So let's see if we can start ferreting out where we believe the questions are going to come. But the other thing I have to tell you about these is, because they're level 3 questions, these are the ones that people most commonly refer to as tricky. Don't make assumptions. As you're reading through these questions, don't make assumptions. Use just the information that is on the test question in front of you, and then answer it based on what the rules are. So let's line up a little bit of vocabulary. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on vocabulary. This is in your notes. But remember, your principal and client, those words are interchangeable. That's the person you have an agency agreement with. You are an agent, which is a legal position. What I mean by that is you are legally authorized to act on your client's behalf. The thing you want to watch out for on the exam is the limitations of being an agent. Yes, I'm authorized to act on my client's behalf, but to give you the easiest example to visualize, as a real estate agent, as a buyer's agent, I am not allowed to sign my client's name. Golly, I got a call yesterday from an agent, been in the business for 8 years, and she literally asked me this question that you guys should know walking out the door. Her buyer made an offer on a property. The listing agent said, yeah, we're going to accept that. Guess what? The listing agent, the seller didn't accept it because they got another offer. And my buyer's agent called me up and said, aren't we under contract? The listing agent said that they were going to accept it. No, the listing agent can't accept that offer. He's not the owner of the property. For that offer to be accepted, it needs to be signed by the seller and then communicated that it's under contract. Up until that time, agents do not have the authority to enter into binding contracts between buyers and sellers. Fiduciary just means trust. You're in a trust relationship with your client. Customer, now be prepared for this. The words client and customer are used specifically in this test. Client's the person you work for. That's the one you're the agent of. The customer is just the third party to you. If I'm a buyer's agent, the seller is the customer to me. If I'm a listing agent, the buyer would be a customer to me. Because in the reason that's significant when you start talking about this, your license and the exam, the reason that's significant is you owe loyalty to your client, but you owe fairness to the other party. So even while I'm being loyal to my client, I can't cheat the other party. If it's material information, I have to tell them. Sub-agency, we'll ferret that out a little bit when we get closer to our question. Sub-agent is just simply an agent of an agent. I work for our KW office. The firm is in fact the agent. I'm an agent of the firm, so therefore technically I'm a sub-agent of my client. I don't go around saying I'm a sub-agent. It's just a legal condition. Okay. Types of agency. Here's some good news for you. Types of agency often shows up on the exam. The reason it does is because it's so easy to write a test question about. So it often shows up. The good news is it's not difficult. So here's what I want you to, matter of fact, my notes are extraordinarily good on this, so you probably don't even have to make any additional notes. Types of agency, when you hear universal agency, we're talking about an unlimited power of attorney. Sometimes this person is referred to as an attorney in fact. If you ever see the word attorney in fact, think power of attorney. If you ever see the word attorney at law, well, that's an actual attorney, someone who has a law degree. Attorney in fact, power of attorney. Attorney at law, that's someone that has a law degree. Excuse me. In regards to universal agency, you are given very broad discretion. However, it's extraordinarily rare in real estate that someone would give you that type of authority, okay? General agency, now the definition of a general agency, I put limited power of attorney, which is correct. But the way I describe it better is probably to say you are given broad discretion, but in a narrow field. Broad discretion, narrow field. Property managers work this way. If I'm managing property for you, then you are out in California or New York, wherever you are, you've actually given me the authority to sign leases, to enter into agreements with tenants and stuff like that. You don't want to fly in and sign every document that every time we lease a property. So you've given me the authority to do that. You've given me broad discretion. Literally, I have the checkbook. I can spend money to make repairs and to pay bills and stuff like that. But my authority is in that very narrow field of property management. If we need to sell this property, I don't have the authority to do that, only to manage it within the constraints that you have given me. So property management is a great example of a general agency relationship. And then finally, special agency. Look, this used to always be the test question. I can't guarantee that's the case any longer, because I think now sometimes they test you on general agency as well. But in special agency, the reason that used to always be the test question is this is the way that buyer's agents and listing agents typically work. You are authorized to do one well-defined task. If I'm a listing agent, my job is to help you find buyers to buy your house, okay? And that once I do that, I'm done. If I'm a buyer's agent, my job is to help you find a house that you want to make an offer in, and then work with you throughout the transaction. But remember, in special agency, I am not authorized to sign these documents for you. I can help you manage this transaction, but I can't sign the documents for you, okay? Tight little package there. Typically, they are tested against each other, okay? And then the best way to create agency is through having it expressed. To be quite honest with you, the best way to create agency is express written, okay? Now, I'm going to mention this, and then we'll take our break. When I say express written, it should automatically treat. Now, I know it's been a while since we've been together talking about agency, but it's time to get these juices lubricated as well. And here's what I mean by that. You have to understand the concept of oral agency. So here's the deal. If I am working with a client, if I'm working with a client on a listing, there is no such thing as oral seller agency. Here's how you will know. Here's how I know as a broker in charge when my agents are working with sellers. they produce for me a written document that the seller has signed. That's the only way they can work with sellers. On the other hand, when they're working with buyers, they could have an oral agreement up to a certain period of time. Buyer agency agreements could be oral until no later than the time of the offer to purchase. Or if the agent says, buyer, I'm only going to work with you if you commit to me. Okay, so I want an exclusive agreement. I promise you, unless it's in writing, there's no such thing as an exclusive agency agreement. But keep in mind, creation of agency, the best way to do it is through some type of express agreement. Hey, buyer, do you know how I'm going to work for you under these terms, blah, blah, blah. But the perfect way to do it is through express written agreements. Those are even better. Let's avoid implied agency in North Carolina because there's a rule that says this: if you are acting like someone's agent and they think that you're their agent, you better be, okay? Because there's no such thing as implied agency in North Carolina. I've often told agents at this, or students, excuse me, at this time, that if you are doing your job correctly, there's no way implied agency could happen. Because the first time that I meet a buyer and it passes confidential information, he starts passing along confidential information, I'm supposed to stop him and go over the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure and ask him how he wants to be represented. If I do that, there shouldn't be any implied agency, because the fact of the matter is that I asked him how he wanted to be represented. He told me how he wanted to be represented. So how could he not understand the relationship? Implied agency should not happen in North Carolina if you're doing your job correctly. The worst case scenario for implied agency is implied dual agency. I'm sitting in an open house. A buyer starts confiding in me. He thinks I work for him. I actually work for the seller because I'm sitting in the open house. Okay. That's the worst case scenario, because undisclosed dual agency is actually a crime. It's a violation of 93A6-4. So it's actually a crime. So creation of agency, I mean, you got to read the questions closely, but you got to be very strict about your rules on that. All agency agreements have to be expressed, and buyer agency has to be reduced to writing at the appropriate time. Boom. Okay. I'm going to open up your mics here. Now, just because I do, it doesn't mean you have to ask a question, but I'm going to open them up. Nikki, for some reason, I can't get yours open. So if you want it open, you're welcome to. Are there any questions that you have on the top of your mind? Charles, you good so far?
So far, so good. Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Anything that you want me to cover in extra depth, let me know. Jackie, you good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Perfect. And Nikki, I can see your face well most of the time, so I think you're still here with me, right? You stop moving, blink or something, Nikki, so I'll know that you're actually there. Oh, there you go. Your screen had frozen for just a moment. I thought you'd put a background there to trick me into thinking that you were there. Hey, Charles, you just snapped your fingers. Did a question come up, Charles? I saw you.
Yes. Going back to your question, going back to when we were talking about asbestos and radon, specifically radon. Radon is a result of depleted uranium. Now, are these houses that are tested and high levels of radon are detected? Are they near like places like, say, near nuclear power plants or anything like that?
It really has nothing to do with that. It has to do with rocks in the soil. So if you have uranium or radium, it's the natural decay of rocks in the soil. And the problem with it is you can't make any assumptions about it. It used to be that agents in Raleigh would say, you don't have to worry about this. We don't have any. And then we started getting tested, and we found out that there's a lot more radon in the area than what we think. As a matter of fact, in Wake County, one of the emergent issues could be whether we're starting to run into radon in the water supplies. And radon in the water supplies would mean radon in the house, because once it comes through the faucet, it's going to go, it's a gas, so it's going to be open in the house. So anyway, no, it's interesting, Charles. There's no automatic assumption about it. You just simply have to have it tested. And some sellers will refuse to test, even though it costs only $75 to $125 on the top end of it. I'm trying to think. I probably did not have one done when I bought my house, and the reason is, half the year I leave my windows open because I like fresh air. I don't worry too much about it, to be honest with you, but I would never tell a buyer to use the same logic that I do. I just always tell them, have it tested. Well, what does it matter? We're over here in Knightdale. In Knightdale, weirdly enough, they had one location that it was so prevalent that the builders literally started building houses with radon systems in them because they were finding so many conditions of radon. We don't get it high here like they would in Pennsylvania. They get extraordinarily high readings there. But we do get it above 4.0 picocuries in several places here, and that's what EPA has said is the threshold.
All right.
Okay, good question. All right, let's take about, hey, the other day I didn't give you a time to be back, and y'all just kind of came back at your own leisure. I'm not going to make that mistake again. So let's be back at 10:15. Give you about 9 minutes to go stretch your legs, get some fresh air. It's beautiful out there.
Okay.
If you don't want me listening to you, make sure that you close your mics. I'm going to close mine.
Okay, so when a couple divorces, the question is, when a couple divorces, the property that they purchased when they were married, then they go from tenancy by entirety to tenancy in common. Is that something that is automatic?
Yeah, it's one of the few times that in real estate that it does happen automatically, and it's kind of like it violates one rule, so it has to. Another time where you would see something automatically happen is if they own property in tenancy by the entirety and one of them died, then the other one would automatically own it in severalty. And look, Charles, in the field, to be honest with you, you're still going to go to an attorney. I had an agent come to me yesterday. She just put a property under contract where at the time the property was listed, it was a husband and wife, and the wife has since passed. And so now the deed still shows that she's on there, but obviously you can't own property when you're dead. So the attorney will take the necessary steps to make sure that that's taken care of. It's all legal, like make sure it passed through the probate process and all that type stuff. So yeah, there are a couple of times when things can happen automatically, and it's typically in a divorce situation or a death.
Right. Okay. And so then if one of the divorcees wanted to pass the property on to the other divorcee, then that's when they do a quick claim?
Probably be as easy as everything, as anything. Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. And then in the field, just to be prepared to take it one level deeper, there might be lenders involved who would have a say about this as well. Because remember, a lender might be looking at it and say, hey, wait. I loan money to both of you. So I want both of you to stay on the title, which again, then you have attorneys and lenders involved. But your logic is right on that, Charles. But
Okay.
that's the difference between test and reality. On the test, you have to answer the question, and what you said is correct. In reality, you don't advise people on how the title is going to work. Okay.
Got it.
Got it. All right. I'm going to put you guys back on mute here, but remember, you can chime in whenever you want to. You're just going to have to hit your space bar. And I'm going to jump back to this. We talked about creation of agency. Yes. So let's start on first substantial contact. Now, let me remind you what this goes with. Working with real estate agents brochure, first substantial contact. So what you need to know is a definition of first substantial contact. And basically what that means is the first point in time where you're starting to talk about confidential information. The reason that's so important is it triggers the fact that you as an agent now have to have the agency discussion with your potential client. I'm not saying he's going to be your client. What I'm saying is at first substantial contact, you have to have that conversation. So notice what my bullet point says here is just be prepared on the exam to recognize when first substantial contact occurs. By far, historically, the most common question on this has been in an open house. When a buyer walks into an open house, is that first substantial contact? Well, probably not. I mean, when they walk in, they don't automatically just start vomiting up their financial situation. So yeah, that's not substantial contact yet. It might be initial contact, but not substantial. It's possible that a buyer could walk all the way through a house and leave, and you never reach substantial contact. However, if they come into that open house and they start saying they're excited about the house, how much do they have to make to qualify for the property, stuff like that. Now you've reached a substantial contact. And what did that trigger? Now you go over the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. You explain agency, and then you ask them how they would like to be represented. As long as you know that course that I just described to you there, first substantial contact, disclosure, which is the Working Real Estate Agents brochure, and then ask them how they want to be represented, and then obviously get it in writing at the appropriate time. Just apply that to every situation. If someone calls me, how does that work? Well, if they call me, there's a real good chance that they called because they saw a listing or something like that. That's probably the only reason they would call me. Well, they could call and ask me about the price. Price is public information. They could ask me how many bedrooms. That's public information. But if they start saying, how much money do I need to qualify? I think we're getting close to a substantial contact at that point. So could first substantial contact occur over a phone? Absolutely. And what do? Recognize first substantial contact, work on real estate agents brochure, discuss agency options. Boom. The answer is always the same. On the test, we don't always use the words first substantial contact. You just have to recognize that that's the case. If you're talking to a buyer, a potential seller, first substantial contact, you must go over agency. Okay. I know it sounds like we beat that to death, but people still mess up on it no matter how many times we go over it. And it's because the questions are hard. Okay. Agency notes. Let me read my notes here and see why I wrote these. Agency agreements are employing contracts and therefore describe the rights and duties of parties and, importantly, when compensation is earned. So I have two thoughts on why I made that note. The first one is just simply this. Earlier, when we were talking about oral buyer agency is okay, but oral buyer agency means you have expressed the terms and asked for agreement. So under oral buyer agency, I may say something like, I'm going to work in your best interest. I'll try to get you the best deal in the transaction. I'm going to keep your confidential information confidential. And I'm typically paid by the seller in the transaction. And you say, well, why did I go through all that? Because now the buyer knows the terms under which I'm going to work for him in his best interest, paid by the seller, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So if he says yes, we have a valid oral contract because he knows the terms. And then the other key part is not only did I underline when compensation is earned, I bolded the word earned to remind you to go back at some point and look at your agency agreements. In this class, it's kind of, in a review, it's kind of hard to go back over the agency agreements because it takes so long to do it. But keep in mind, one of the important parts about agency agreements is they discuss when you've earned your compensation, not when you get paid. When you get paid is usually a different story. You usually get paid at closing. You've earned your compensation when you help the buyer go under contract on a house, or you earn your compensation as a listing agent when you brought a ready, willing, and able buyer to contract. Okay, so that was important for that. And then note words like subagent of seller working with buyer. Now I'm going to stop right there on that point because this is the customer scenario that I was describing earlier. Now you have to separate reality from the exam. And what I mean by that is, if I go over buyer agency with a buyer and ask them, can I be your buyer's agent? They're going to say yes, okay? But legally, they could say no. I could explain working real estate agent brochure and buyer agency, and that buyer could say, no, I don't need to be represented. That's a completely legal position for them to be in. They just need to understand if I'm not representing them, I'm most likely representing the seller, and anything you tell me can and will be used against you. And then I have them acknowledge on the Working Real Estate Agents brochure that they understand that I'm not their agent. Later on, when they tell me confidential information, I'm going to point to it and say, you understand I'm not your agent. I have to tell the seller this information. The problem on the exam is the disconnect. You're thinking in your mind, why in the world would a buyer do that? Don't think that. If we tell you that it's a buyer customer, or if you are a subagent of the seller, then just go with it. That's the way the question is composed. This agent has no agency with buyer and owes fiduciary duties to seller. I think I said that. Remember the effect on communication as well. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that bullet point. Again, these are hard to brief, so you're going to have to go back and look at these. And the best are on my midterm exam. Do you remember communication? That meant these questions. Buyer makes an offer. Seller has options. He could ignore it. He could counteroffer it, or he could accept it. If the seller accepts it, it has to be communicated back to the offering party before it comes to contract. Do y'all remember those questions that we did? Some in class, some you had some test questions. I'm telling you right now, just make a note to yourself. Go back and study those, because after you study them, what you can do is you can say, hey, Chris, on the second midterm, actually it wasn't second, it would have been the first midterm. On the first midterm, question number 38, can you explain to me why this is or is not a contract? You have to know those in just major detail. And I tried to do one in every circumstance. Okay. So anyway, you'll see what I mean when you go back and start studying those, but I would be surprised if some of you don't say, why is this correct? We need to go over those together. Okay. Dual agency, perfectly legal with consent of the parties. And then when does it need to be in writing? Oh my gosh, this is another toughie right here as well. I hate to beat you to death by 1 point, for 1 point, but the fact of the matter is passing or failing could be determined by 1 point. So let me remind you of this story that I told you in class about dual agency. Is oral dual agency ever legal in North Carolina? I'm not going to put any of you on the spot on this. Charles got it though. Charles felt confident with it. So he's remembering that conversation. Oral dual agency is legal in North Carolina, but it can only arise out of oral buyer agency. Do you remember that discussion? Nick, do you remember that? Okay, Jackie, I can't see your head, but I'm assuming if you didn't, you would let me know. You have to go back to the notes on that topic. Look, it's only good for 1 or 2 questions, but it takes a level 3 question off the table for you if you can remember the rule. If it's written by your agency, forget about it. None of that applies. Dual agency is legal. It has to be in writing at the appropriate time. Has to be agreed upon by both parties. And then for designated agency, we can only ask you this on the North Carolina side because it's different in other states. But let me remind you, designated agency is a form of dual agency. I will tell you, on the class exam, we used to have a question that would say firm ABC and firm XYZ, and it would talk about designated agency. Well, I could automatically rule that answer out because ABC and XYZ can't practice designated agency together because they're not dual agency, all right? And then the rules about designated agency, don't try to write these down right now. I promise you they're in your notes. But there are 2 times when designated agency can't be practiced in-house. One is a provisional broker can never be designated for the buyer if the broker in charge, if his broker in charge is designated for the seller, and vice versa, okay? In other words, my provisional brokers, I can't practice designated agency with them because I supervise them. It wouldn't be fair. I know everything about their clients. They know nothing about mine. It wouldn't be fair. Commission doesn't allow it. Commission also does not allow designated agency if I have prior, any agent involved has prior confidential information about the other party. So as a buyer's agent, I could not be designated if the listing was my next door neighbor because I probably know everything about my next door neighbor. So I wouldn't be allowed to practice designated agency. If I know material facts, that's fine. But if I know confidential information, that messes it up. Go back and look at your notes on those 2 things right there. It'll be well worth it for you. Material facts, you're clearly going to get tested on this. So the first thing is recognizing material facts. The second thing is recognizing the language, misrepresentation, omission that goes along with it. Having said that, here's the beauty of material facts. We can't ask you difficult questions where you have to make a decision about whether something's a material fact. We'll pretty much tell you. In other words, if there is a leaking pipe underneath a sink, okay, well, that's a material fact. So that's not going to be what the question is. The question is, did you disclose it or not? Did you lie about it or not? That's the way the question is going to come up. So material facts, facts about the property, facts about that relate to the property, facts about abilities of a principal to complete a transaction, or anything that a party tells you is important. Those are material facts. Also, this is important right here. When talking about material facts, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that there are some things that are material to your client only. For example, if I am a buyer's agent, hey, Jackie, I just saw your hand. Are you raising your hand or were you just adjusting your camera?
Yeah, I was adjusting my camera, sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I'm just going to keep on then. There are some things that are material to my client only. For example, if I am a buyer's agent and I learn that the sellers are going through a divorce. Now, some people would look at that and say, well, that's nobody's business, Chris, come on. Well, it's the buyer's business. Because if the buyer thinks they can get a better deal on that property because those people are going through a divorce, he's obligated, I mean, I'm obligated to give them that information. I might look at it and say, oh my gosh, I feel uncomfortable giving them that. Well, I don't work for the seller. I work for the buyer. I'm obligated. It's a material fact. What they choose to do with it's up to them. And then, of course, here's where your test questions are going to lie. Now, let me remind you, and I'm sure I have this written down somewhere, so you can go back and look at it as well. But let me remind you of a really great test question, okay? A great test question would look something like this. A listing agent is aware of a defect with the seller's home. The seller nor the agent discloses this to the buyer or the buyer's agent. It is discovered after closing. According to Real Estate Commission rule and license law, who is responsible for this non-disclosure? Now, actually, I don't know if I said the first line correctly, so let me go back and correct that again as I break this sentence down. A listing agent is aware, okay, so he knows about it. There's no doubt about that. If he knows about it, he's supposed to disclose it. I should have said of a hidden defect. And the reason that's important is if I'm reading a question and I see that it's a hidden, H-I-D-D-E-N, a hidden defect, well, the buyer agent can't discover it if it's hidden. If the buyer agent can't discover it, he can't be responsible for it. Then a little bit later in the problem, I said something to the effect of, according to license law and commission rule, who is responsible for this non-disclosure? And in this case, it would be the listing agent only. And here's why. Well, it's not the buyer's agent because he couldn't disclose, he couldn't discover it. And it's not the seller because the seller has no obligation under commission rule or license law. They don't have a license, so they're not responsible. So when you start reading the questions, you have to unpack them. These are level 3 questions. So in fairness, you're going to have to unpack these. Now, if I were to ask you what the listing agent was guilty of in this particular case, I would argue that it is a willful omission. Now, why would I argue it's a willful omission? The agent was aware of a hidden defect and he did not disclose it. Willful, he knew. Omission, he didn't say. Does that make sense to you? And on each one of these questions like this, you're breaking it down. What was the problem? Well, in this case, a non-disclosure. Who's guilty? In this case, the listing agent. And then what's he guilty of? In this case, he knew it was material and he didn't disclose. If he had known about it and just flat out lied about it, if the buyer had said, hey, is everything, as far as you know, is everything okay in the house? Everything working okay? And the agent said, hey, are you going to do a home inspection? Buyer says, no. Oh, everything's working fine then. Now that would be a willful misrepresentation in that case. Notice the last trick that I threw in to that little point. It does not matter whether the buyer does a inspection or not. Should a buyer do an inspection? Obviously, a buyer should do an inspection. But the fact that he doesn't change the fact that if the agents know material facts, they still have to disclose it, okay? We can talk through that. However, again, I'd have to steer you back to your questions for you to get the real intensity at which you're going to be tested on those. And I know I make it sound like a lot. It's really only 1 or 2 questions that you're going to get. 1 or 2 questions here, 1 or 2 questions up here about agency and stuff like that. Let's go back to a softball question. This is just memorization right here, but it's worth it, okay? What you owe to your principal, another word for that is client, right? Loads, loyalty, obedience, accounting, disclosure, skill, care, and diligence. You must have undivided loyalty for your client. You will obey. Now, remember, you will obey the lawful request of your clients. If they ask you to do something illegal or unethical, you still can't do it just because they're your client. Accounting, you must account for the money coming into your possession. Disclosure, we talked about material facts and whatever disclosures are important. And then normal skill, care, and diligence. Your job is to discover material facts and disclose them to the extent that a reasonably prudent agent would be able to discover these. Duties to third parties, don't lie to them, don't cheat them, and you owe material facts to everybody, okay? Yeah, memorize those lists, look back at some old test questions. That's fairly consistent with the way they test that. as we get into liabilities for breach of duty, remember we're in the agency chapter now, so we're talking about what happens if you breach your duty as an agent. Well, here are all the entities and laws that are looking over your shoulder. First of all, the commission. So a couple of questions about the commission, which at this point you should know these hands down, okay? Just because I violated, matter of fact, I don't care how major a rule I violated, the real estate commission can never fine me as an agent. They can reprimand, censor, suspend, or revoke. Now, the fact of the matter is, if it's a major violation, they may revoke my license versus reprimand, but they still can't fine me no matter how egregious it is. Commission does not have that power. Now, here's what the commission can do. This is a tricky little question. Even though the commission can't prosecute me and fine me, they could actually recommend to the courts. As a matter of fact, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission actually won awards for helping pursue loan fraud claims coming out of the year 2008 after we had the last meltdown. So they can recommend to the courts that courts take action, but they can't do it. The courts can fine and imprison you for violations of license law and other statutes. But the commission, but the courts can't take your license. The commission can do that. Now, the court can recommend that the commission get rid of your license. I mean, they can recommend it, but they can't do it themselves. Obviously, you can be sued, but that's pretty much the same in any walk of life. Okay, so those were liabilities of breach of duty. Pretty straightforward. Okay, moving into a slightly new section here, Residential Property Owners Association Disclosure Statement, the RPOD. Okay, so now we're moving on talking about disclosures. And there's some very straightforward questions that come up in regards to disclosures. Doesn't make them simple. It just means they're straightforward. So first of all, let's start with this simple concept. I'm sure they're all written down here. Yeah, off the first bullet point. All sellers in the state of North Carolina are required when selling their home to provide the property disclosure statement with modest exceptions. Now, so let me tell you what I mean by all. When I say all, it means it applies to houses listed by agents, but it also applies to for sale by owners. In and of itself, that could be a test answer, okay? Then we talk about the exceptions. The two main exceptions you see right here, I did write down the two main ones, are new homes and foreclosures. I also put lease options in there just so you would know that as well. But the two main ones are new homes and foreclosures. New homes do not have to provide the property disclosure statement. New homes typically provide warranties. That's better than disclosure to me. Foreclosures, the bank never really owned the house, so they're not required to disclose properties. Now, if I buy a foreclosure and then I turn around and sell it, obviously I would be responsible for the disclosure. But the sale from the bank would not require a RPOD. The other important point here, it's the seller that completes the form. This has historically been the question that they have asked on the exam to try to trick you into believing that the agent completes this form. No, the seller completes the form. Now, I'm not saying you can't give them advice. Your advice is, my advice, you don't have to follow mine, but my advice would simply be, hey, seller, fill it out to the way you're comfortable. If you're not comfortable answering the question, just put no representation, okay? But this is not my opinion about whether things are working or not. The only exception I'll say to that is, if the seller checks that something is working correctly and I know it's not, I would suggest that the seller fix that. The commission does say that we do have a advisory capacity on these, but the seller completes this form, okay? All sellers, meaning for sale by owners, including those working with agents, and seller completes the form. Agents simply inform the buyers and sellers of their rights. And what that means is, hey, buyer, you have a right to have the property disclosure statement before you make an offer. If it ever comes up, which I don't think it'll come up this straightforward, but if it ever does, all disclosures should be given before the first offer. Lead-based paint, before you write an offer. Property disclosure, before you write an offer. MOG, before you write an offer. That's ideal. That's ideal. And then what's my advice if I'm on the seller side? Seller, fill it out the way you believe is correct. If there's anything wrong that I see, I'll let you know. And then finally, seller, it's your obligation to provide this to the buyer prior to the time of offer. If you don't provide it to the buyer by the time of the offer, seller, the buyer may have a right to rescind the contract up to 3 days after the contract. Seller checking no representation does not absolve agent. No matter what the seller puts on that form, it does not absolve the agent. Whether the seller chooses to fill one out or not does not absolve you from your obligation to disclose material facts. Feel good about that? You've heard that 100 times by this point. Okay. Now we're moving into contract law. Contract law, I actually like this chapter because it has a ton of questions in it, and most of them are straightforward, but you have to follow your rules. You got to follow your rules here. That's the way contracts, they were meant to say what they're meant to say. Bilateral versus unilateral contract. I don't know what kind of test question they could ask on bilateral versus unilateral. The offer to purchase is bilateral. The buyer has obligations, the seller has obligations. Matter of fact, the only example I gave you in class of a unilateral contract was something like a option contract, where during the option period, the buyer has the unilateral right to walk away. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on bilateral versus unilateral. Look at your notes. It's level 1. Move on. Valid, voidable, and void is a little more interesting here. But let me remind you, matter of fact, weirdly enough, we were just talking about this in the office yesterday. To buy real estate, you have to be 18, sane, and sober. Now, what can you learn from that? 18, you must be the age of majority to enter into a valid contract, right? If you're not 18 at the time of the contract, then that contract is voidable, meaning you could walk away, the one that's under 18 can walk away, but the party that's over 18 cannot. They're bound. So voidable means one party can walk away, but the other cannot. Sane. Well, here's an easy one for you. You cannot enter into a valid contract with a person that is legally adjudicated to be insane. Okay, they're not legally competent. Those contracts are considered void. They never even had a chance. And then what was the last one? Sober. Sober again, they have to know the repercussions of their actions. If they could prove that they were too high or too drunk or got knocked in the head and didn't know the repercussions of their actions, they can walk away from that contract if later they decide to. And again, keep in mind, this is a test. So don't start playing attorney on this. Just remember the examples that I gave you and don't question those if they come up on the exam. Don't worry about, well, how do you prove someone's insane? Well, the question will tell you if that's the case. Or how do you know that someone didn't have legal capacity? The question will tell you. Essential elements of a contract, these are important, but I don't know if they're important from a standpoint of memorization of the list. It's important for understanding why these concepts are important. So for example, essential element of a contract, there's mutual assent. There must be a meeting of the minds. And the way we get to a meeting of the minds is you make me an offer. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to use some of the language I used when we were talking about this in class. You make me an offer, and that offer should not be illusory. The offer should be very well-defined terms. In other words, if I don't know what it is you're offering, it's hard for me to make a valid acceptance. So the offer should be well-defined terms, and then my acceptance should be unconditional. In other words, if I have to change something and send it back to you, well, that's a counteroffer. That's not an acceptance. Interestingly enough, I had this question come up yesterday as well. I had a very busy day yesterday as a broker in charge. I got a lot of questions yesterday. This one was from as a matter of fact, I mentioned it earlier. I'll give you a little more detail now. An offer, she made an offer on a property. The listing agent literally said, oh, we're going to take that. We're going to sign that. That's what the listing agent said. What happened was when they sent it to the seller was not content with the closing date. So the listing agent called back and said, oh, look, we just need to change the closing date by a couple of days. You okay on that? But otherwise, we're going to accept everything else. So they changed it. They changed it by 2 days, which made it a counteroffer, right? This can't be a contract. Guess what happened? Literally within an hour of that conversation, the listing agent got another offer and called back the buyer and said, I need your highest and best offer. And the buyer said, highest and best? I thought we were under contract. So it really got pretty tense, but it's exactly what we talk about in class. It's not a contract until we have well-defined offer, unconditional acceptance, signed and communicated back to the offering party. Okay, that's always the answer. That's how we get a meeting of the minds. Consideration. Now, keep in mind, here's the trick on consideration. It's not a trick. It's not hard. I actually hope you get this. Consideration, there has to be something in exchange for something for a contract to be valid. What I suggested to you in class is a lot of times in a contract to purchase a house, it's simply my promise to buy for $200,000 in exchange for your promise to sell for $200,000. It's the mutual exchange of promises, okay? And the reason I mention that to you is notice at the time that we go under contract, there may have not been any money that exchanged hands. There doesn't have to be due diligence money. There typically is, but there doesn't have to be. There doesn't have to be earnest money. There typically is, but there doesn't have to be. But it doesn't change the fact that we're under contract. So consideration does not necessarily mean money. In my example, it was the mutual exchange of promises, okay? Something in exchange for something. However, the other thing that we may try to trick you on this is for you to understand that earnest money is not consideration. Just because I gave you earnest money, that wasn't the consideration. The consideration was the exchange of promises, okay? The parties must have capacity, 18 sane and sober. We've already talked about that. And it must be for a lawful objective. Now, I do want you to notice my note down here as well. Those are the essential elements of a contract. If we were in class right now, I would bring up the fact that notice that it doesn't say that a contract has to be in writing for it to be valid. Well, that's true. A lot of contracts do not have to be in writing to be valid. Real estate contracts have to be in writing because of the statute of frauds, okay? Not because of the law of contracts, but because of the statute of frauds. So clearly the statute of frauds is a theme that you see throughout the course. Statute of frauds says contracts to convey an interest in real property must be in writing to be enforceable. And then of course they have to spell out the terms and they have to be signed by the parties, okay? And then the other note that I made here as well, I think we've gotten away from this question, but I still think it's an important question. Almost every contract that we talked about in this class has to be in writing for one reason or the other. Try not to confuse the two. Agency agreements have to be in writing because the commission said so. Contracts to convey have to be in writing because of the statute of frauds. So in other words, the statute of frauds doesn't care about agency agreements. That's a real estate commission rule. And the real estate commission does not have the authority to determine whether contracts are valid or not, okay? It's actually a really important point. Discharge of contracts, yeah, not radically important. So we'll run through this fairly quickly. I have a note down here I do think is important. Discharge of contracts, when we talk about contracts, we don't really talk about termination so much. And the contracts, we talk about discharging them. And what I mean by that is that typically speaking with a contract, I only have two options. I complete it or I breach it. So one of the ways that we could terminate or discharge, a contract would simply be by mutual agreement. If Charles and I are in a contract together and we shake hands and decide to go our separate way, well, we have a right to do that because we are the parties in the contract. So that's an agreement of the parties. Matter of fact, if Charles says, I'll tell you what, Chris, I'll allow you to break the contract if you give me $2,000. Well, technically, that's not a breach of contract. It's different terms, but it's still a completion of the contract, okay? So agreement of the parties could happen. The best way to discharge a contract is clearly full performance. I buy the house, you sold the house, I get the deed, you get the money, everybody's happy. That's the best way, but it's not always the case. Impossibility of performance. I want you to be careful here. I want you to note impossibility of performance and death. Impossibility of performance actually means this. If I sold you my house and then tomorrow my house burns down, well, unfortunately, the subject of the contract is no longer there. It would make it impossible to perform. But notice that death does not automatically trigger the impossibility of performance. So here's the deal, and the question has always been the same on the exam. A buyer and seller are under contract. The seller has some type of horrific accident, a motorcycle crash or an airplane crash or whatever. The seller's dead. What happens to the contract? The contract is still valid. And the reason is our contracts are written to the buyer and seller, their heirs and successors. So the contract is still valid even though the seller died. The reason that that's an important point for you is because notice that it's different in agency agreements. If I list someone's property and they die, well, it was a personal services contract. If the person I signed it with dies, he can't perform. So it would terminate an agency agreement, okay? But if it's under contract between the buyer and seller, death does not terminate that. I can't imagine that the test question being any more difficult than that. Tell you what, here's a test question I do love. It comes up all the time. The remedies for breach of a contract. I would suggest relaxing your brain and just take this as it is, because it actually kind of makes sense once you know the vocabulary. So remedies for breach of contract, somebody has done something to get out of this contract, okay? And so the first thing is money damages. Now let me talk to you about money damages, because it's time for you now to start remembering some of the terms of the offer to purchasing contract that we use in North Carolina. So here's exactly what our contract says. If the buyer goes up to literally the day of closing and then changes their mind, I don't care, he could have a reason, it could be for no reason at all. But if that's the case, first of all, here's what I know, the seller's going to be mad because they thought they were closing today. And the seller's going to say, I'm going to get my attorney and sue you. Well, seller, save your money, because in the offer to purchasing contract, it says this: if the buyer terminates the contract or breaches the contract at any time, the seller will be entitled to the earnest money as liquidated damages. Okay, so how much, and listen, I don't care what day it is. If it's after due diligence and the buyer breaches the contract, the seller is going to get whatever the earnest money is, no more, no less. That's what our contract says. So we introduced money damages, and then I also introduced the word liquidated damages. So don't forget to go back and treat these as vocabulary words here, okay? Liquidated damages are predetermined at contract formation. Buyer, if you breach, it's going to cost you the earnest money. Boom, let's not discuss it any further. But if the seller breaches, two things could happen. One, if the seller breaches for no reason, he just flat out changed his mind, the buyer can say, I'm going to sue you for specific performance. We contracted on this property. I plan to get this property. Dang it, you're going to sell it to me if it means I have to go get the courts to tell you to sell it to me. So if the seller backs out for no reason, he can be sued for specific performance, okay? On the other hand, if the seller is just unable to deliver title, then the buyer is entitled to be compensated for his loss. So the seller, if the seller breaches, the buyer will be entitled to compensatory damages. He'll be entitled to be made whole, okay? So it's kind of interesting to look at that from the contract standpoint. Rescission makes for a difficult test question, so I doubt you're going to get anything on rescission. I doubt that it's going to be the right answer. It might be the off answer or something like that. But rescission just simply means, usually a court severing the contract, return the parties to their original position. Hey, seller, you got the house back unencumbered. Buyer, you get your monies back. Now, if y'all want to get back together and go into contract again, that's fine. But the courts are just rescinding the contract. Okay, it's good for a test question. I like that. Agency agreement types. Now, this is always good for a contract. So we're talking about contracts here, and now we're talking specifically about agency contracts. In this case, we're talking about listing agreements. There are three large types of listing agreements. There's the open listing agreement, which is extraordinarily rare, exclusive agency, which is somewhat rare, and exclusive right to sell, which in most cases is going to be the answer to the question for test purposes, and here's why. Exclusive right to sell means that the agent is going to get paid regardless of where the buyer comes from if it happens during the term of the listing agreement. So if I have a 6-month listing agreement and it's an exclusive right to sell, I don't care if you sell it to your brother. I'm still entitled to be compensated. That's what exclusive right to sell means, okay? And that's why if you get a question about what's the most common type in the MLS, exclusive right to sell. Because otherwise, as an agent, it's going to be hard for me to justify spending money on your listing if I don't know I'm going to get paid. Let me back up from that and tell you this. Exclusive agency is not bad. It's not bad, but here's the problem with exclusive agency. The seller can compete against me as a for sale by owner. Exclusive agency means I'm the only agent that's going to list the house. And if I sell it, the seller's going to pay me. But if the seller walks next door and sells it to his next door neighbor and I'm not involved, I don't get anything. And that's what I mean by I can't justify spend a lot of marketing dollars on this if he could just sell it to somebody and not pay me. And then with an open listing agreement, here's what the open listing agreement says. Pretty much any agent that has a listing agreement with the seller, and you heard me right, there could be multiple listing agreements in an open listing scenario, but the only one that's going to get paid is the agent who ultimately brings the buyer. There was a great question on this at the end of our chapter. I think it was overly hard, but it's very instructive. And the case was this seller was offering open listing to any agent who brought a buyer. Well, an agent from XYZ brings them a buyer, and ultimately the question states the idea that the seller's not entitled, the seller's not required to pay XYZ. Why? Because XYZ never had a listing agreement. Even though it only would have been an open listing agreement, they still had to have an agreement for compensation. So open listing, you're competing against everybody, all buyers, all agents, and the seller. Exclusive agency, hey, you're the only agent that has the listing, but the seller could sell it himself. Exclusive right to sell, that's what I want, because that protects me at any point during the listing period. You're always going to get test questions on that. So just make sure, whether you got it from me or whether you go back and study your notes, make sure you understand the distinctions between those. Questions actually fairly straightforward on that. Okay, continuing on in agency, then we got into a section of the, was there a question? Okay, continuing on with agency, then we got to a section of the class where we started what the commission calls a transaction cycle. So it's basically, hey, agent, when you're in the field, these are the things you're going to be doing, and we're going to ask test questions around them. So focus on that. So basically what they're saying is, before you have a client, the first thing you have to do is get a client. Okay. So we're talking about soliciting. So I'm going to read what my note was here. And if I went to the extent of writing a note, I thought it was important. So when soliciting for a listing, be careful of antitrust laws. Now, in regards to antitrust, if you can visualize this question, you're probably going to get it right. Antitrust, I cannot fix prices. And I know that you think as an agent, you say, oh my gosh, well, I'm small game, and in 12,000 agents around here, what do people care what Chris does on setting prices? Well, keep in mind, I can't imply that there are certain requirements that sellers have to pay. So listen to these two terms, same ones I use in class, and see if you can recognize what I'm talking about here. I'm sitting down at a listing presentation, and I tell the seller, hey, seller, my fee is 6%. To list your property, my fee is 6%. And the seller says, good gosh, Chris, you're the third person I've talked to, and you all say 6%. The next thing that comes out of my mouth is very, very important. What I cannot say is, well, 6% is the industry standard. Because if I do, I'm considered to be price fixing. Now, I can say this, 6% is my company policy. Assuming that that's true, I can say that. Because if the seller is not happy with that, they can just go to a different company. So it's not price fixing for me to say that. And then what's weird about this is you'll have questions every once in a while that talk about the fact that all commissions are negotiable. But the fact of the matter is, if the seller says, hey, Chris, I heard that all commissions are negotiable, will you go lower than 6%? No, negotiation over. Okay, so if he doesn't like that answer, he can get another agent. Now, and by the way, I'm certainly welcome to go less than that if my company policy allows it. But I'm also okay to state what my policy is. And I just can't say what the industry policy is. Boycotting laws. Now, again, picture what a question would look like in regards to boycotting laws. I am mad at this one company because when they list their houses, oh, I don't have to make up an example. Here's an example. There's a builder in our area who pays buyer's agents about 2%. All the other builders pay 2.5%. So would it be okay? Well, let me just go ahead and tell you, it's not okay. If I were to start a boycott against this builder and say, hey, let's not send our buyers to him until he starts paying 2.5% like everybody else, okay? Boycotts are illegal. They're a violation of Sherman Antitrust Act, big time trouble for doing stuff like that. Same thing could happen if it was a group of lawyers that were boycotting, if it's another firm, for example, if it's any group of industry participants that we chose to boycott to try to make a point illegal. And then finally, do not call laws. You're probably going to need to go back to your notes on this because I was very, very specific about do not call. Let's start at the simple and let's move forward from there. Do not call people that are on the do not call list. All right, boom, that was simple enough. It's actually, let's make it one level more complicated. Do not call laws apply to residential, not businesses. So don't call anybody at a residence that's on the do not call list. However, just like every law, there are exceptions. And if I were you, that's what I would study, is the exceptions. Here are the business exceptions to who we can call. Now, and by the way, you do understand there's other exceptions as well. You can call your friends and family unless they tell you to stop calling, okay? And then if someone gives you specific information to call, obviously you can call them as well. But the way I think you're going to be tested on this has to do with the business exception. And it looks something like this. You can call someone for up to 3 months after having provided them information about your services. So for example, on my website, I might have a button that they can click that says, if you click on this button, I'll send you information about my first-time home buyers program. Okay. Well, if they click on it and then they give me their phone number, I can call them for up to 3 months after they requested that information. Okay. Unless they tell me to stop. I can call someone for up to 18 months if I actually provided them a service. So let's say I acted as a buyer's agent. They bought a home from me. We had an actual relationship. I can call them for up to 18 months after providing an actual service, unless they tell me to stop. Okay. So that's the do not call laws and the exceptions. Having nothing to do with what we just talked about there, I did add a couple other notes. Make sure to get all required signatures. Example, if it's owned by husband and wife, make sure you get both. I mean, obviously that's important. I can't remember what made me think it was important right there, but hopefully you'll know what that means. Okay, to collect a brokerage fee as a agent, to collect a brokerage fee or commission as an agent, remember these things. You must have a valid real estate license. Let's take it from the obvious and let's go to the less obvious here. The obvious question is, what do we mean by valid real estate license? It's not enough that you have a license. You have to have a license on active status, which means you've paid your fees, you're current with your CE if necessary, all of that type stuff. You have a valid real estate license. If you're a PB, it means you have to have a broker in charge, okay? Now, let me go slightly more difficult. Hopefully, this is hard to synthesize, but it's not hard to understand once you hear it. You can always ask me questions about it if necessary. Okay, here's the situation. I have a, well, okay, there's no doubt some PBs are getting out of the business right now. We're going through a tough time. They're going to get out of the business, but they've got their real estate license. And guess what? They're active right now. So let's say one of my PBs comes up to me and says, Chris, I can't afford the business anymore. I have a buyer, but he's not going to buy for 8 months. I can't wait that long to get my first commission check. So I just got to go get another job. So I say, fine, no hard feelings, whatever. And so here he does two things. One, the provisional broker gives us the name of the buyer and says, look, could I get a referral fee if he ever buys a house? Fine, we have no problem with that. And then I get rid of him as an agent. I cut him from the roster. And if he's a PB, he can't have an active license without me, okay? Without a broker in charge. Well, anyway, guess what happens 8 months down the road? His buyer buys. Well, his buyer buys 8 months down the road. The PB clearly does not have an active license at this point. So here comes the ultimate question. Can I pay him a referral fee on that buyer that he gave me 8 months ago? Charles, you finally missed one. You were on a roll. All day you're on a roll, but you finally missed one. But let me make it real easy for you, Charles. Was he active at the time that he gave me the referral? Yes. After that, he never practiced any brokerage activity. He didn't give the guy any advice or anything like that. So what I'm actually paying him for was work he did while he was licensed, and that's fine. So here's the point. You don't have to be licensed at the time you receive the compensation, as long as you were appropriately licensed at the time you earned the compensation. And only thing he did to earn the compensation was give me a referral. Okay, so that is the toughest way that we can ask that particular question. Valid real estate license, active at the time that you did the brokerage practice. There has to be an agency agreement in place. There has to be an agreement for compensation in place, and must be a procuring cause of sale. I don't think we test you very difficult on procuring cause of sale, but procuring cause of sale, if anyone ever asks you, procuring cause of sale is defined as being the agent who started this unbroken series of events which led to a sale. Normally, we have this discussion in the Code of Ethics. I don't think you're going to be tested on it, so I'm going to move on. Listing arrangements, make this very simple. These things mean exactly what they say they are. Your listing agreement has to tell how you're going to get paid, but it doesn't tell you that you have to be paid a certain way. There's no doubt that percentage of sale is the most common. Agents list houses for 5% or 6% of sale price, whatever. That's fine. That's percentage of sale. However, I saw a listing agreement the other day that said, regardless of what I sell this house for, you're going to pay me $5,000. So in other words, it wasn't based on a percentage. It's just, you're going to pay me $5,000 if the house sells. Net arrangements are legal, but not recommended. And here's what I mean by that. A net fee arrangement just simply means me, the agent, I get to keep anything above an agreed upon net. Nikki says all she wants from selling a house is $125,000. Okay, can I keep everything over 125? Sure, whatever. If we have a contract that says that, we can do it legally. The problem is it is fraught with problems. That's why you don't see it a whole lot, but it's legal. Okay, listing fee arrangement, boom, nice tight package. How can you be compensated? And then commission sharing and the function of the MLS. We used to ask test questions about the MLS. I don't know if they still come up or not, but if we do, here's the purpose of the MLS. The MLS serves two purposes. One, it's a database. Same stuff that you see when you go to places like realtor.com or something like that. And you look up houses that are available and what their amenities are. So the MLS, in one standpoint, is just a database. The other thing that MLS does that's kind of interesting is it's a cooperation and compensation agreement. So when I put something in the MLS, when I list a property in the MLS, and I tell you, Charles, if you bring me a buyer, I'll pay you 3%. Well, if you bring me a buyer, Charles, you're a member, I'm a member, you bring me a buyer, I have to pay you the 3% because we have a de facto contract through the MLS. It's not really a real estate commission issue. It's a MLS issue. We just happen to be members. So what's the function of the MLS? One, it's a database. Two, it's a compensation and cooperation agreement. Disclosure of third-party compensation. Let's hit this, and this will be the final topic that we do for today. Okay, you do want to have a star beside this. I'd be surprised if it doesn't come up later as well because it's so important. Disclosure of third-party compensation. The words that you need to have associated with third-party compensation is you must make a full and timely disclosure if you're receiving third-party compensation. Let's keep it simple. Let's focus on the buyer's side. As a buyer's agent, isn't the buyer agent almost always paid by the seller or the listing agent, technically? Okay. And so even though I'm the buyer's agent, I'm being paid by the other party, third-party compensation. The reason that it's not as big a deal with the seller and with the listing agent is the listing agent is paid by the seller, and the listing agent tells exactly how much that the seller is going to pay the listing agent. But on the buyer side, I have to disclose to my buyer in a full and timely manner the extent of my compensation. So, hey, buyer, here's the situation. In this area, buyer's agents are typically paid 3%. So in the buyer agency agreement, I write 3. And then when they sign it, I have technically acknowledged how much I'm going to make. Well, what's the problem here? Well, what if you're in an oral buyer agency agreement? Literally, every house that I show them, I should tell them how much I'm going to be compensated. Now, if you can make a blanket statement, it's fine. If you could say, for example, buyer's agents typically make 3%. And if that's true, technically you don't have to do that at every house as long as that's consistently true. And then obviously you have to reduce that to writing. Full and timely disclosure, reduced to writing at the appropriate time, which is no later than the offer to purchase. It has to be reduced to writing. So let's talk about the trick questions that are going to come up here. First of all, what do we mean by full disclosure? Full disclosure means full disclosure. If I am receiving a bonus, hey buyer, I'm receiving not only 3%, but also a bonus. And I should tell you that in a timely manner. Technically, there's not a specific rule about a timely manner, but I usually think of it as before I show you the property. In other words, in time that you can make a decision whether I'm doing it for your interest or my interest. Okay, full and timely disclosure. Charles, I'm getting 3% plus a $2,000 bonus if you buy that house. I'm not actually asking Charles's permission. What I'm telling him is if he buys that house, I'm getting 3% plus $2,000. And I'm going to ask him to acknowledge that. Okay. If he doesn't want me to get a $2,000 bonus, then he doesn't have to buy that house. Okay. So full and timely disclosure in writing. Here's the other trick. The timely disclosure doesn't have to be put in writing. It only has to be put in writing no later than the offer to purchase. So in other words, I could verbally tell Charles that I'm getting a $2,000 bonus if he buys this house. And then if he does buy that house, I reduce it to writing no later than the time of purchase. And here's your last big important point on today. Here's another trick they try on the exam. The question becomes, where do I do this disclosure? Well, the short answer is we have a form for this. You don't need to know the form number, but we have a form for this. But here's where the trick comes in. The trick is, well, you just found out, agent, that you're getting a $2,000 bonus. You found it out at the time of writing the offer to purchase. Why don't you just put it in the offer to purchase? Well, the reason you don't put it in the offer to purchase is because Rule 112 says specifically that you can't put anything about your commission in the offer to purchase. Things about your compensation should go in agency agreements, not in the offer to purchase. The offer to purchase is between the buyer and the seller. Okay? So disclosure of third-party compensation, there's just so many sexy questions that can come out of that. Full and timely disclosure. What time does it need to be in writing? Where does it need to be put in writing? And then finally, the final twist that I can put on that is, all right, Charles just learned that I'm getting $2,000 bonus on this. And Charles is like, wait a minute. You're already getting 3%. You're already making $12,000 on this house. And now you're telling me you're going to make a $2,000 bonus? And Charles says, how about a little something from me? Okay. So the question is, can I legally give a buyer part of my compensation in a transaction? Can I legally give my buyer, he's not licensed. Can I give an unlicensed buyer part of my compensation in a transaction? And the answer is actually yes. And here's why. Remember, the reason you need a license is to be compensated when selling for others, buying or selling for others. Charles isn't buying or selling for others. He's the buyer. So he's not a third party. He is the party to the transaction. I can give him whatever I want to, assuming that we're in agreement. Now, I don't have to, but I'm saying I could. And then his lender would have to approve it, and it'd have to be on the settlement statement. Those two are technically the same thing. If his lender approves it, it will be on the settlement statement, okay? But could I give it to a buyer or seller? Absolutely. They're participants in the transaction. They're not third parties. All right. Let's stop right there for just a second and open up your mics for just a little while here. Okay, I opened up your mics. How's everybody doing so far?
So far, so good.
So far, so good? Okay. Well, we did our little game this morning. It took a little bit of time. And Jackie had mentioned the idea of 2-hour reviews. And I'm perfectly content with that. We went just over 2 hours today. We got some good stuff. When we come back on Wednesday, we're picking up with offer to purchase and moving on. Nikki, anything you'd like to get on the floor before the weekend? Today's Friday, right?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Sorry, I got to plug the computer in real quick.
Oh, that's okay. Anything going through your mind that we need to get on the floor?
No, everything that you're doing is like going really well. I really like this format.
While it's not 100% comprehensive, the fact of the matter is I do try to highlight things I think are more important than others. Sometimes I miss, but at this point, remember what we're trying to do is get you as many points as possible. Charles, anything that you need me to either spend more time on, incorporate, or what's going to help you pass the exam?
Actually, Chris, I'm good. I'll just be rereading and watching all your videos and going over the study materials you emailed us, et cetera, et cetera.
And by the way, the one that we did on Wednesday, and I'll put this out for the others who haven't been able to join us, these are actually up on my YouTube page. Well, this one's not yet, but the recording from Wednesday's on my YouTube page, and I'll do the same thing here. You guys have heard it, so I doubt seriously if you're going to want to listen to the 2 hours again. But if there's something I said that resonated with you, if you can go through it, then maybe you can, because of the screenshot, you may be able to go to that point. Jackie, everything going okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything you'd like to add or subtract from what we're doing?
No.
Okay. Keep in mind, I'm going to ask you these questions every time we get together like this. So if y'all come up with other ideas, let me know so that I can incorporate them into it. And I think we probably have about another, I don't know, looks like maybe 1.5 days of going over this, and then we'll determine how to deal with math.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
If there are no further questions, you guys are free to go today. Good to see you. Y'all have a great weekend.
Yes,
too, Chris.
Bye.
Stop, please. How do I stop recording?